Crow Country continues the trend of indie devs keeping the spirit of old-school survival horror alive. It's in line with titles like Signalis, Alisa, and Tormented Souls. Recent titles from smaller studios being faithful to old-school survival horror with their own twists. Crow Country has its own bag of tricks to add tweaks to the survival horror formula. It's one I came across during a recent Steam Next Fest, finding the demo promising. Does the full game live up to the promise of the demo? Yes, and then some. Crow Country is some of the best interconnected level design I've come across in some time. There's several great puzzles that don't fall into common survival horror trappings. Its presentation and perspective add a flair that helps Crow Country stand out. It gets my stamp of approval and well worth your time. Before we begin, a disclosure that I received a review key from its publisher, Neon Hive. Set your clocks back to 1990. Crow Country is a theme park that shut down a couple years back on the outskirts of Atlanta. We play as Mara, a police officer and firearms expert. She's come to investigate a missing persons report on the park's owner, Edward Crow. Mara in many ways reminds me of Heather from Silent Hill 3. Spending time in abandoned, spooky theme parks is one reason. But Mara has some of that smart-ass attitude. There's some pretty funny flavor text when examining objects. Also notable is the swagger in your step. When I first saw Crow Country, what grabbed my attention was its presentation and perspective. Final Fantasy VII was the first thing that popped into my mind. It's a mishmash of Final Fantasy VII with dashes of the PS1 Resident Evils and Silent Hill. The difference here is that you can rotate the camera around. You have the option of movement through tank controls or more modern movement. There's no need for two control schemes. Tank controls are mapped to the D-pad and the analog stick for a modern scheme. This will sound like sacrilege, but with the camera perspective and movement, I preferred using the analog stick. Your mileage may vary, but at any point you can swap between the two. The music complements the visuals well. The tracks help evoke the setting of an abandoned amusement park full of monsters. The save theme does a great job of evoking the "you're safe here until you leave" feeling. I did find a few cases of visual clutter throughout Crow Country. Nothing that was a deal breaker, but something to note. I found myself stumbling into traps at points while running through an area. Although, to note, Crow Country keeps you guessing while returning to previous areas. Nothing is ever static. New traps and enemies will continue to pop up. Combat in Crow Country pulls from more action-oriented horror titles like Resident Evil 4. Most notable with its use of laser sight aiming. As in most cases, getting a headshot is your best bet. Aiming can be a bit tricky with the camera perspective. I mean that in a good way, the survival horror way. It's not like Resident Evil 4 where enemies are weaving back and forth. Here, enemies, with a few exceptions, are slow and head straight for you. It's the aiming that requires a bit more time to get your desired outcome. I have to note Mara's proficiency in firearms, with her ability to wield a shotgun one-handed. You can make use of grenades and traps in the environment. Of course, if you're not careful, you'll fall victim to them instead. As mentioned, Crow Country will replenish past areas throughout. What used to be an empty space is now full of new enemies and traps. To make note of the enemies, they're not animatronics. This is my first thought when I saw the game. Makes sense with it being an abandoned theme park, no? That's not the case. And what these monsters are is something you'll have to dig up through the game's story. There are some unsettling designs here. The low fidelity look give plenty of room for the player to fill in the blanks. While most enemies are slow in movement, there's one that stands out with its start and stop runs. With more of that RE4 connection, Crow Country doles out certain supplies depending on how you're doing. If you're running low on handgun ammo or medkits, the game will distribute them throughout. While you won't be swimming in them, you can only carry a certain amount, it's not like you'll run out. For the more powerful guns, ammos, and health kits, you'll have to seek those out. Before going over item and resource management, let's talk puzzles. While Crow Country takes more of an action focus with its combat, it's old school survival horror with its puzzles. It has some of the best balance of puzzles I've come across in a survival horror title for some time. Nothing I found to be too brain dead simple. Most have a nice sense of satisfaction finding out the logic and reasoning to solve them. There are several optional puzzles that bump up the difficulty. Completing these reward you with better guns, upgrades, and better gear. One upgrade are boots for faster movement. They remind me of the hover boots from Zelda, where you don't come to a complete stop but glide a little afterward. Although you may want to think twice about using them, especially once the game ramps up on laying down traps later on. Crow Country is very much a game where you want pen and paper nearby, where you can work your way through the clues to come up with the logic and reasoning to solve a puzzle. This is how I like my survival horror puzzles. A common trapping for puzzles and survival horror titles is finding a note, remembering its contents, and replicating that elsewhere. A one-to-one translation. I've never been a fan of these so-called puzzles. That's not to say it doesn't happen in Crow Country. There are a couple of them that do so. But this is the exception and not the norm. Otherwise, you're sorting through what you're given to come to a conclusion in solving. Crow Country does a great job of making the puzzles work with the theme park setting. Notes scattered about of where to find items or codes. So many of these rides and contraptions and attractions keep breaking, so you'll find items scattered all over the place. With regard to resource management, Crow Country doesn't use a limited inventory system or item boxes. For ammo and consumables, you can only hold a certain amount at one time. I always prefer when survival horror titles do have limited inventories. That said, I understand it's tough to pull off. It's a delicate balance. You get it right, it adds so much to the experience. Resident Evil has always been the best when it does so. If you don't get the balance right, you end up with something like Silent Hill 4 where it can drive you up the wall and create frustration. But Crow Country is able to pull off an impressive feat without resorting to a limited inventory. For lack of a better term, it's where you get into a flow state, where you're thinking several rooms ahead. When you find a new item, you're thinking back of where you could use it. When you have a survival horror title with limited inventory, it's much easier to deliver an experience that gets you into this flow state. Think any Resident Evil title with limited inventory, where you also have to consider how many item slots to leave open on your next journey out. Crow Country's greatest feat is being able to pull off this flow state without needing a limited inventory. Tormented Souls, a title I mentioned earlier, did as well, but nowhere to the extent that Crow Country does. How's the game able to do this? It does so through a few key design decisions. One is how the game doles out information. There are several areas accessible in the early game where we'll need an item to progress or a code to find. We may not come across these items or codes for some time. Beyond keys, some items have multiple uses. By the time you find that item or key, you'll know of a few places of where you can use it. This can open you up to finding new items and pathways, which in turn lead to more excursions. Of course, the game always keeps you guessing with replenishing old areas. Backtracking will have new enemies and traps to deal with, always keeping you on your toes. And like any good survival horror title, Crow Country has several shortcuts to unlock along the way. Where its level design excels is how it remains interconnected throughout its entire playtime. It's common for later stretches in survival horror titles to be more self-contained than what came before. The early stretch is more interconnected, with later stretches more linear. Some can have a large drop-off in quality and enjoyment after the game's earlier stretches. Resident Evil 7 after the main house is a perfect example. I was curious how Crow Country would handle its later sections as we move below the park, but it avoids the common pitfalls of being more self-contained. Instead, it opens up new shortcuts to the park's surface, and even opens up new areas we couldn't access before up there. It's some of the strongest interconnected level design I've come across in some time. No noticeable dips in quality that can plague later stretches in these kind of games. These design factors allow Crow Country to throw you into a flow state even without a limited inventory. It does make me wonder how Crow Country would be with a limited inventory. To be fair, that's a design decision that you don't take lightly. It's very tough to pull off without veering into frustration. I never fault a survival horror title that doesn't make use of it. That said, you lose part of an enhanced experience a limited inventory can help provide. For Crow Country to be able to do this without a limited inventory is a testament to its strong design. The pen and paper for puzzles comes in handy because there's a lot to remember here. You want to make note of where you could use something. There is a fortune teller machine that can help you point you in the right direction if you're stuck or you need a hint. As far as the story goes, it's unwrapped in the vein of classic survival horror. Plenty of notes scattered throughout to piece together what happened at Crow Country. Why did the park close down a couple years back? Where is its owner that we're trying to find? What are these monsters that we come across? And what's up with Mara? She seems to be hiding something from us, and those we'll come across. Something doesn't quite add up about her story. We'll stumble across several other characters along the way, each here for their own reason. This will all unfold in time as the game progresses. It all builds to a satisfying ending. The game makes clever use of the game mechanics to drive the plot forward for plot revelations in its end stretch. There's plenty of humor in these conversations with others. Some points can get self-referential, but the game is earnest in everything it does. Mara knows when to get serious when things take a turn for the dark. As you've noticed by now, there is no voice acting in Crow Country. They could have gone the route for some hammy voice acting. Alisa did a great job with it, for example, but going with text here feels like the right choice. I'm glad I checked out Crow Country during Steam Next Fest and getting it on my radar. Some of my favorite games the past few years have come from indie developers keeping the spirit of old school survival horror alive. Ones that take the formula and add their own unique twists. Games like Alisa, Signalis, or Tormented Souls. You can now add Crow Country to that list. It's one of the better games I've played to have come out in the last several years. It has some of the strongest level design I've come across in a survival horror title for some time. It has the right balance of puzzles that don't fall into common survival horror trappings. Its presentation and perspective gives it a flair to stand out from other titles. While it pulls heavy influence from titles past, it meshes them together to become its own thing. If you're a fan of what I cover on the channel, then Crow Country is well worth checking out. It's further proof that if you want a quality, new survival horror experience that pulls from the genre's heyday, look to the indie developers. Thanks for watching.